program. On the line with us, our old buddy, Professor Richard Wolff, the economist, co-founder of democracyatwork.info, author of numerous books. His latest, The Sickness is the System, When Capitalism Fails to Save Us from Pandemics or Itself. You can tweet him at Prof Wolff or democracy at WRK. Wolff has two F's on the end. Professor Wolff, welcome back to the program.
Thank you, Tom.
Always glad to have you. The war in Ukraine is taking place in what is either the fourth or fifth largest wheat-producing nation in the world that is supplying a substantial quantity of the calories of the planet, particularly to northern Africa. I recall that the Arab Spring was kicked off when a Tunisian street vendor protesting the increase in the price of wheat caused by climate change, wiping out, North African farmers from Syria all the way to Tunisia and Libya, self-immolated, lit himself on fire. What is this going to do to the economy of the world? What is it going to mean for food insecurity around the world? And ultimately, how might this also affect the United States?
Well, this is a wonderful question because it raises what everyone should understand are all of the secondary and tertiary, unintended, often consequences of making war. And I should be clear, making war both militarily, as the invasion of Russia in the Ukraine, but also making war economically, which is what the United States and Western Europe in the main have been doing to Russia ever since. There will be lots of consequences. For example, the inflation will go up further than it would otherwise. It will last longer than it would have otherwise. And that's going to take a terrible toll on Americans, particularly those in the lower half of the income distribution. But to get to your particular example, if the farmers in Ukraine cannot get to the production of wheat, then yes, it will affect the global wheat market. And while it is true that the wheat from Ukraine goes particularly to the Middle East and North Africa, wheat is a global commodity. If it is short in one part of the world, then people who would otherwise starve will be forced to offer more money to get that wheat from other places, and therefore the whole price of wheat will be raised. It's a simple old supply-demand. The demand for wheat, the demand for food is constant or growing at a regular pace. Suddenly, the war, in this case, withdraws a portion of the supply, and then you have the bidding of all the rest of us for the scarcer amount of wheat in the world market, and it will drive the price up. But it won't just drive it up in North Africa and the Middle East, where it's scarce. It'll drive it up for everyone, including everything in the United States that is made out of wheat. The price of wheat, by the way, has been growing in the United States very dramatically even before Russia invaded Ukraine. So while there'll be some voices blaming the war for all of this, that really isn't true. There are many factors. The war, and particularly the war in Ukraine, because of its wheat production, will aggravate that thing that was already underway. But again, we need to see the war in perspective. It is going to make trends in our economy that were already there last longer and cut deeper, and that will now include food because it will be impacted by all of this.
In America, we have what the government refers to euphemistically as food insecurity. You and I would call it hunger. There are millions of American children who go to bed hungry every night, millions of families who are rationing food or who are eating food that, frankly, people shouldn't be eating. I mean, they're living in food deserts and things like this. It seems like this is just going to exacerbate that problem. I don't, frankly, recall the exact numbers. Maybe you know them, but my recollection is that food stamps provide people with roughly $3 per day per person to buy food. Maybe it's more than that now. I've been doing this show for 19 years, and a lot of numbers have flown by me, and a lot of inflation has incurred during that time. But How should American policy change to deal consequentially with this, coming increase? It sounds like a substantial increase in the price of food in the United States.
Well, I think the answer to that is to take a page from American history. We had a war called World War II. And during that time, there was a shortage of food, mainly because machinery, railroads, entities in our economy that were crucial to the food system had to be reassigned to fight World War II. And so the food production was cut short, reduced. And what food was produced was given to the military and a priority. And so we knew as a nation that the vast majority of us would now have to live for an unknown number of years of that war with a food shortage. And here's what we did. We made a decision as a nation, which is one I would support right now, not to allow the market to dictate who gets the scarce food. That is, not to allow the food prices to go up so that the mass of poor and middle-income people couldn't afford them, and we would have rich people buying milk for their cat before middle-income and poor people could buy milk to support their children. And so what we did in America, and what we ought to do now, is a rationing system. The government printed and distributed ration cards. If you wanted to buy food, it wasn't enough to have money. If you didn't have a ration card, you were not going to get that quart of milk, that dozen eggs, that gallon of gas for your car, the pound of meat, the pound of coffee, or whatever else it was. That was a way of being fair about distributing the food shortage. If we want to do that in our country now, to be fair, we would have to do something similar. And it tells you a lot about the Republican and Democratic parties in this society that they're not even thinking about that chapter of American history in this time of rising inflation, which, of course, like all inflations, is a market phenomena that is best for those who have a lot of money and worst for those who don't.
My parents both lived through that. I remember as a kid growing up with stories about, rationing food. And not just food. I mean, my mom, I don't know if it was to her dying day, but I remember as a kid, she would, when the toothpaste tube was, seemingly completely out of toothpaste, she would squeeze it in the door, close the door on it to get that last little bit out, something that she learned to do in the 1940s when I don't know if toothpaste was rationed or if it was just so expensive.
Well, there is an example that you bring up. They rationed oil and gas. In other words, you couldn't get more than a certain number of gallons of gas. And by the way, the government did that just again like now when fuel prices were going crazy, as they are going now. So the same logic applies. And I'd like to drive home to your audience that when the government handed out the ration tickets, it handed out, you'll love this, to each according to their need. In other words, if you were a rural family, you got more gas coupons because you had to work your car, your truck, you had to go longer distances. That's what rural means. Urban people didn't. If you had a larger family, you got more coupons for milk or meat. In other words, there was an attempt to be socially fair about a period of difficulty.
But my parents, my dad was a rabid Republican all his life. His father was a rabid socialist, and I think that it was an abreaction. But nonetheless, the stories that I heard about World War II as a kid were that everybody pulled together. Even if they hated Franklin Roosevelt, once the war happened, everybody pulled together. I can't imagine that happening today when you've got Republicans promoting the idea that people shouldn't even wear masks after 1 million, or nearly 1,970,000 Americans have died from a deadly disease. Oh, we don't need masks. We don't need. How do you get them on board for something as what they would describe as radical as rationing, food or fuel?
Well, it has something to do with those we call leaders in our culture, in our spirituality, in our religions. What happened in World War II was that the argument was made, by the way, explicitly, that if you want a unified country to fight and win a war, you better treat everybody together. We better not just say we're all in it together. After all, we all say that. We said it about COVID, and it wasn't true. Older people, poorer people died in much greater numbers than wealthier people. But if you really want unity, you better have a rationing system. Otherwise, the disunity at home will produce anger, bitterness, envy, and social divisions, which will not only be bad for us here at home, but will undermine and undercut the war effort. And boy, it seems to me all that applies right now.
Yeah, amen. Professor Richard Wolff, the co-founder of democracyatwork.info, and Prof. Wolff with 2 Fs on Twitter. Professor Wolff, thanks for dropping by today. It's always great talking with you.